Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the economic system status of the AP6, the UK, Russia, Iran, China, Nigeria, and Mexico. First of all, need to understand some terminology here, one of which is economic liberalization. And economic liberalization is not liberal as in like triggering the libs, calm down. No, it's economic liberalization in terms of the classical liberal definition, which is free. Liberal at its heart means free. So if you're economically liberalizing, what you're doing is making your economy freer. So economic liberalization is when countries create policies that reduce government action in the economic system, moving towards a more free market style system. And so what we've noticed is that over time, when countries get freer with their economy, their people are usually better off over time. The more constraints you put on that economic system within government, the worse off you get. Okay. So this is the debate between nationalizing and privatizing entire economies. Should the government be public, meaning something that is like an entity run by the government, or should they be privatized? So, privatization is the act of making a government owned business or property privately owned. Essentially, the government saying the job that I have been doing or the factors of production I've been overseeing are now going to go over here to private owners. And it's a sign of more liberalization, more economic liberalization. Nationalization is the act of making a privately owned business or property owned by the government. And sometimes you hear the process known as that this process is going to be nationalized. That is less economic liberalization. It actually doesn't happen that commonly. You will see it most commonly during a time of war when certain aspects of your economy that are important to the war effort are nationalized. So let's talk about the AP6 and their current, both their current status and then throughout modern history, governments and how they become more and less economically liberalized and important events to know within these countries. All right, let's start with the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, the status pre 1945, going all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, very free market, very, very free market. So businesses took really big advantage of this. Then you had the World Wars. And in 1945, a big report was released called the Beveridge Report that said, look, what you need to do is that we need to create womb to tomb coverage for the citizens of the country. And so it led to this huge nationalization effort called the collectivist consensus. And it created the current welfare state. That includes the pride and joy of the United Kingdom, the National Health Service. Okay, so it became a very, I mean, again, we're not talking about a socialist state, but a huge, enormous welfare systems. Since 1980, some of that has been chipped away. And so right now, you could classify the United Kingdom as a kind of a combination neoliberal slash welfare capitalist state. There's plenty of private businesses out there, and they have extremely strong safety nets. So this would be the one that would be currently the most similar to the United States, except we don't have nationalized health and we don't have as strong a safety nets. We do, however, have much better growth. The UK currently has one of the lowest GDP growth rates in all of Europe. GDP per capita is also not terribly strong. And people are kind of trying to figure out, well, what is going on economically with the UK? But still pretty strong neoliberal welfare capitalist state. The Russian Federation, the Russian Federation from 1919 to 1985 was under the control of the Soviet Union, very strong nationalized state. It was a socialist economy at the time. Starting in 1985 under Mikhail Gorbachev, you started to see some privatization, allowing factories to not do quotas, allowing people to have their own farms. And then in 1991, when the Russian Federation comes about, the Soviet Union ends, you have the wild, wild west. You have privatization like literally overnight. It's called shock therapy. We'll discuss that further. And then from 1999, when Vladimir Putin takes over, you start having limited nationalization, mainly of oil and resources. And in 2014, you had significant nationalization. And when the war happened in 2022, a lot of nationalization. Now, this is a market socialist state. A lot of the basic industries are public, they're owned by the government. There are still some private businesses, obviously, but but definitely overseen by the government big time. This, because of the war and the economy is doing worse and worse and worse, major economic problems forward, possibly a significant economic collapse. Iran, everything in Iran is pre 1980, post 1980. So pre 1980, you had a dictatorship known as the Shah's dictatorship. Uh, and it was a much more privatized, almost a westernized style of economic system. While you had a dictator, you had a more freer market system. And then in 1979, the Islamic Revolution happens, and the Islamic Revolution tries to meet the needs of the people. If you remember that Islam is a very one of the pillars of the Islamic faith is that this charity is given to the poor. So they are more of a welfare capitalist state. There's plenty of private businesses and business sectors, but there's a lot of strong government ownership. Oil industry is a parastatal, basically owned by the Islamic Republic. Uh, Even though it's a welfare capitalist state, it's such a poor economic condition right now in Iran, high inflation, that you know the government services don't really get down to the people in any kind of meaningful way. So when you look at welfare capitalist state, don't think like Denmark or Norway or something like that. No, this is those services exist, but the government doesn't have the ability to actually present them to the people. So it's not like the people are very well off. The People's Republic of China. Pre-1978, you have first the dynasty empires, and then the Chinese Communist Party takes over, and these are very nationalized. During this Chinese Communist Party, a socialist economy, no private ownership. In 1978, President Deng Xiaoping takes over, and he starts privatizing the economy, moreover and moreover and moreover and moreover. And then in 2012, you start to see this slow shift, partly because the party becomes more nationalistic, but then Xi Jinping takes over, and more and more parts of the country are being nationalized. Any major company in China now has members of the Chinese Communist Party overseeing their boards of directors. This really wasn't the case going into the 90s and the 2000s. It was a much more freer system. You saw much more privatization. Now, a lot of those gains are being taken back. Um, it is a market socialist state. Most basic industries are controlled by the government. You still have smaller private businesses. You have, of course, larger tech firms that are private, but they are totally overseen by the Chinese Communist Party. They have access to all that information, all that data. They will follow the policy of the Chinese Communist Party. So you have a lot of state-owned businesses, state-overseen businesses, and currently, because a lot of these drawbacks, you're seeing the country primed for an economic downturn. It was said that the GDP of China would pass the United States in the 2040s. That does not look like it is the case right now. Nigeria's economic status, as soon as it became a state in 1960, very wild, wild west laissez-faire. Between 1970 and now, oil was nationalized, the parastatal of the Nigerian National Oil Company. Most everything else is very private, but again, the government doesn't have the ability to create safety nets because everything is so corrupt. So that's the big thing about Nigeria is just you can't really create an economic system that's beneficial and works because the system is so corrupt. So you call it kind of a very weak laissez-faire slash neoliberal state with the government trying to provide services, but the bureaucracy is completely just engrossed in like a mud churning. It can't move with any purpose at all. There's a ton of private businesses. Everybody in that country hustles, but there's little government oversight. You can't collect taxes to pay for anything because there's so much informal market transactions out there. So you'd call this weak laissez-faire neoliberal state, a ton of private businesses, a lot of dynamism, but just an ineffectual, totally corrupt government. And then finally, Mexico. Mexico, between 1875 and 1910, under the time period of Porfirio Diaz, they were a more privatized state. Then you had the Mexican Revolution. A lot of nationalism and nationalistic fervor takes place. You have the development of the PRI, which is the political party that will run Mexico from about the 1930s early 1930s until 2000. You get what's called the Mexican Miracle in the 1940s through 1970s, where the more nationalized system actually does pretty well. And then it starts to taper off as the world goes more of a globalized format. And so you have since 1970, essentially more privatization. In 1994, you have the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which allowed for free trade between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. This really helped, especially northern Mexico, grow much bigger than the South. It created also a big uh, cleavage between a much poorer southern Mexico and a much more wealthier northern Mexico. Of course, drug trade, the cartels are problematic to the economic system, and there's also significant corruption. You would call Mexico a neoliberal state, limited safety nets, a ton of private businesses, a lot of market transactions going on, a huge amount of potential here, but the government can't seem to get out of its own way and allow markets to run and really get better. Okay, so neoliberal states, we go Nigeria, Mexico, obviously not part of the AP6, but the United States. Welfare capitalist state, you're going to get the UK as a successful one, then Iran as a not so successful one. Um, uh, Market socialist countries, China and Russia, they, by the way, are continuing to move over towards that more nationalistic end, less economic liberalization in Mexico and China as the years go forward. And what the future holds, we shall see. Countries at war and countries with dictators don't traditionally do very well.